This is NatSec Matters.
I'm Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Mr. Glenn Korn, a foreign policy expert with 34 years of experience in the U.S. intelligence, defense, and foreign affairs communities. Glenn is an expert for the Cipher Brief, founding partner of Varyag Consulting, and an adjunct professor at the Institute of World Politics. Mr. Korn previously served as a senior executive in the CIA and has completed 4 tours as a chief of station in the Middle East and Eurasia. Mr. Korn joins us today to discuss recent developments in Syria, the rising tensions between Turkey and Israel, and the shifting dynamics of the Middle East. Stay with us as we speak with Glenn Korn. Glenn, welcome so much to National Security Matters.
Thank you for having me.
Well, you have served your country ably all over the Middle East and Eurasia. Today, I think we should talk a little bit about Turkey. We talk about the Middle East a lot, but we don't talk so much about what's going on with our NATO ally, Turkey, and its interests into Syria and Lebanon. But let's just start with Turkey. Remind us why Turkey is so important.
Well, as you mentioned, major NATO ally. Geographic location, position is extremely important for the United States, I think, in our foreign policy, our national security interests. Long-term relations, which, generally positive, always complicated, and definitely, dealing with the Turkish government going back years has always been challenging because the Turks are very, very proud of their sovereignty and sensitive about being seen as, Washington dictating policy to them, which is fair, right? I mean, they are a sovereign nation. It's a country with a lot of experience, let's say, in the Middle East, the Caucasus, that goes back to the time of the Ottoman Empire, the Mediterranean, North Africa. So we have a lot to learn, I would suggest, from the Turks. And my experience dealing with the Turkish government officials they are very, very well educated, very professional. And I've come across many Turkish diplomats and other officials who really they're worth listening to. Yeah, on matters that are important for the United States.
So what is U.S. policy towards Turkey?
Great question. I think U.S. policy generally is, it's a mixed bag. We try to have good relations with the Turks, and in some areas we do. Again, NATO partner, we've tried to have a lot of cooperation, but there's a lot of stresses on the relationship bilaterally and multilaterally. Some tied to our policies towards other countries that are seen as competitors or rivals with Ankara. If you look at the Greek-Turkish relationship, which has its ups and downs, that impacts U.S. policy often, in my experience, because there's a large Greek community here, and we have interests in Greece. In the Middle East, sometimes we don't agree on issues with the Turks. Today, if you look at the situation in, the war in Ukraine, Russia's war against Ukraine, our policy, the Turks did not sign on for a lot of the sanctions that we imposed. I would say that the U.S. government policy has been pretty smart towards Turkey, understanding of Turkey's very delicate situation. But that's caused some, animosity and some resentment towards the Turks here in Washington. And of course, the Turks, President Erdogan, has been very critical of the U.S. position on Ukraine in the past, or on, towards Russia. So if you cross the board, we have trade relations, very important, economic relations. I always say, of course, there's other bilateral, like what we call irritants, but the biggest one being our support for the Syrian SDF, YPG, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which the Turks consider a terrorist organization.
Yeah.
They consider it the PKK.
Right.
Which, by the way, Washington also recognizes as a terrorist organization.
Yeah.
So a very complicating factor in the relationship. It takes a lot to work with the Turks, but we get a lot out of the relationship, a lot positive. And there's a lot of potential, I think, for more positive results from our investment in the relationship with Ankara.
So let's jump into what you just mentioned there. They obviously have a lot of deep opinions and history with regard to the Kurds, and that might motivate their feelings and policy towards northern Syria. Can we go a little bit deeper into U.S. supports YPG and others for the purposes of counterterrorism, right?
Right.
Turkey feels like we're dealing with terrorists ourselves. Is that a good summary of what's going on there?
Yeah, and generally the Turks believe, we had an agreement with the Turks during the Obama administration in 2014 when ISIS kind of exploded, in Iraq and Syria. They spread very quickly. We partnered with the Syrian Kurds, what is today the SDF YPG, to kind of counter ISIS, and they were a very effective fighting force. At the time, the Turks were against it, but they kind of agreed to it because the deal was it would be temporary. And I forget what the exact terms were when we made the agreement. But the Turks believe that it's gone on way too long.
Right.
And there's a lot of concern that the Syrian Kurds view it as support for an autonomous, basically a Syrian state. And so it's gone beyond just counterterrorism to the political realm. And so that causes a lot of stress and tension. And, the Turks have said, like with counter-ISIS work, we're ready to work with you. We're capable of working with you, but you have to stop supporting a group that is killing Turkish citizens and Turkish soldiers. And one issue I saw, I've seen for years in Turkey is if there's one political issue that unites all Turks, whether they're, opposition or whether the AKP, Erdogan's party, it is the issue of their anger at our support for the SDF YPG, right? It's a unifying position. And of course, our adversaries have exploited it to try and undermine our relationship with Ankara, and the main adversary being Russia.
So what would they have us do, though? We obviously, the United States, have a huge interest in shutting down ISIS in that area. You said they want to work with us more. I know they work with us some. Would they have us turn our backs on the YPG? And would the Turks really get involved in a large way to combat ISIS with and for us?
The Turks have said they would. I personally think that we could probably have an agreement with the Turks that we will continue to do counter ISIS work in Syria ourselves with Turkish support, with Turkish cooperation. The issue of the Kurds, I don't think that is my personal opinion. We can't be seen as abandoning them completely. So we have to have an agreement with Ankara and, of course, now with Damascus. And by the way, they're moving in this direction, which is a positive development, I think. The government is now unifying all the different elements in the new Syrian regime inside of Syria. And the SDF is now talking with the government about integrating into the national military structure, which I think would be a positive development.
Turks okay with that?
The Turks, I think, are okay with it. One, because they have a lot of influence over the current leadership in Damascus. I would give them credit for the ousting of Bashar al-Assad, which I think was a great development for the United States.
Well, we got to get into that.
Yeah.
But they would, I think you said, prefer them to be part of the Syrian National Army because that means they're not out there operating on their own and on behalf of a future Kurdish state.
Right. And my understanding is that what they're saying now is they're not lobbying for a future Kurdish state. They just want an autonomous region inside of Syria.
Yeah. Okay. So before we get to the issues we just discussed, what about this when we hear and read about it all the time, these enormous refugee camps that are supposedly full of ISIS soldiers, and this group, YPG, is guarding them for us on our behalf? I mean, did the Turks understand that that's a vital U.S. interest for us to keep them down? And by the way, what are we going to do with these camps in the long term? Are they just going to sit there forever?
I think the Turks do understand that it's a vital interest for the United States. The Turks have either offered to secure those locations, and they also argue that the SDF YPG is using them to kind of blackmail its position there, the United States, to I think, holding us there, right? I think there could be a solution found between Ankara, Damascus, and Washington And by the way, also the European countries like the EU, because a lot of the people there, if they're freed, they're going to go back. We remember the terrorist attacks in Europe. So it's probably going to take a whole of
region approach.
But the main players, I think, would be Ankara, Washington, and Damascus, and there could be a solution. But yeah, the Turks are well aware of our concerns about, I think it's al-Hol is the main one.
Now, could all this come together with the Turks stepping up if the President Trump, who has at different times vowed to take U.S. soldiers out of Syria, do you think that we would have some sort of future deal where maybe the YPG isn't doing so much work, but Turkey steps up and that allows the United States to get out or reduce? Or
I think that could be one way of approaching this. I think that President Trump has a really good opportunity right now. And the Turks generally were welcomed his return to power. And so there is, the Trump administration has an opportunity now. It's complicated, no doubt about it. It's the Middle East. There's nothing easy in the Middle East.
That's right. All right. So let's go back. Let's rewind to, you said that obviously Turkey played a huge role in kicking Bashar al-Assad out of Syria. Can you review for us, when did Bashar al-Assad and Erdogan fall out? What was the triggering event that got Turkey to really start acting hostilely against that regime? And just sort of, briefly, of course, but, take us through how it all went down.
I think that the Turks felt that, the Assad regime was basically persecuting the Sunni population in Syria. During the civil war, some of the things that the Syrian regime did actually predates the civil war, right? But, under Bashar al-Assad, when the civil war sparked again, when there were mass protests and then the regime used violence and the civil war started, the Turks had been trying to develop or maintain a relationship with Damascus, but at some point it broke. And of course, I think President Erdogan sees himself as a leader of the Sunni world. And definitely the Turkish people felt that they had an obligation to try and help the Sunni population in Syria. Turkey was faced with large numbers of refugees. After, I think per capita, probably Lebanon has the most number of Syrian refugees in the world. And then after Lebanon, Turkey, and Turkey had to deal with the economic fallout and consequences of that. And it created all kinds of challenges for the Turkish regime. Both foreign policy wise, internal security wise, and then domestic politics. That the Turks had been supporting HTS, especially in Idlib for years. There was a strange situation where, it was the Russians, the Iranians, Lebanese, Hezbollah, the Turks, the U.S., all mixed in. But late last year, this is my assessment, Assad was offered some outs, some negotiations, I think by Washington and by Ankara separately, to kind of ease his isolation. And he turned down both offers. And at the same time, HTS started a campaign out of Idlib that developed very quickly. The regime collapsed.
And HTS is
it's the opposition group that was formed on the basis of many extremists, terrorists.
Okay.
So including members of al-Qaeda, again, like when Syria, my experience was one day somebody was tied with ISIS, next thing they were al-Qaeda, then their opposition. It's very, very fluid.
Right.
Right. But some of even the leader now of Syria, he has ties to extremists.
All right. So Syria had a couple of occasions, Bashar al-Assad had a couple of occasions to end his sort of isolation.
Turned him down.
He turned him down because he was too close to Iran, or why would he have turned him down? Why would he have turned down better relations with Turks?
Good question. I don't know. All I know is that my understanding is when he did that, and this is based on some of the reporting I've seen in the media, that when HTS started a kind of offensive, a lot of the people around Assad said, "You're on your own. You mishandled two separate opportunities to end our isolation and economic stagnation, and we're not standing by you this time." This is the beginning of the end. And if you remember, initially the HTS operation was designed to like defend them in Idlib, and next thing you know, they were in Damascus. I mean, the Syrian regime collapsed very quickly, and now Assad's living in Moscow.
So there've been a lot of articles about why they fell so quickly, but you're an expert. What's your take on what in the world happened?
Internal corruption, the lack of support or the frustration with many of the people around Assad, like his supporters who turned on him because he was not supporting them. And again, I think he probably squandered an opportunity or two opportunities to reduce some of the tensions or stress that they had on Syria and on that inner circle. And of course, years of fighting, years of pressure, corruption in the armed forces, corruption in the intelligence services, that probably eventually, and of course, economic problems.
Oh, did anybody see it coming? I mean, we talk about intelligence failure a lot. Did this qualify as intelligence failure, the rapidity with which Syria fell?
I have to stress, I was retired when this happened. I can't say what was going on in the intelligence community, like what assessments were written, but I think a lot of people were caught off guard.
Yeah, okay.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Glenn Korn.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
All right, so I want to come back to Russia's role in Syria and then bailing out, but let's start with Turkey. You mentioned that Russia have a complicated relationship with Erdogan. I mean, it feels like Erdogan has been supportive of the Russian position on Ukraine, but on the other hand, he's kept the Black Sea closed. He seems to be selling drones to the Ukrainians. What's your sense of how Erdogan is handling Russia and Ukraine?
Yeah, what I would say, it's not really true that he's been supportive of the Russian position on Ukraine. He was one of the leaders, and I say this all the time. Turkey, before February of 2022, was providing the Ukrainians more support than many of our other NATO allies.
So why were they?
One, they want to have a relationship with Ukraine. Two, for example, they never recognized Crimea as not being part of Ukraine. And at points, I'm trying to remember, like in 21, Erdogan invited Zelensky to Istanbul for a summit. And I think the Russians kind of tacitly threatened him not to do certain things, which Moscow didn't want to hear. And Erdogan disregarded what the Russians said, welcomed Zelensky, talked about territorial integrity, their support for, Ukraine being part of, Crimea being part of Ukraine. They announced additional defense agreements, the support, Turkish armed support for the Ukrainian military. And if you remember in the beginning of the fighting, the expanded fighting in 2022, the Bayraktar, those drones,
right,
those UAVs were playing a huge role on a par with our javelins. There are kids now in Ukraine named Bayraktar. And so the Turks, the Turks actually paid a price for that because the Russians then punished them economically. They cut off tourism, which is a huge source of revenue for the Turkish economy. They used COVID as an excuse to stop flights to Turkish resorts in the spring and summer. And so I think we have to give the Turks credit and they knew this was going to happen. They're very smart. They know the Russians very well. As they'll tell you, they've been dealing with them for, 600 years. And so I think they saw this coming, but they took a principled position in support of Ukraine. Which I think, we should welcome. But what they'll tell you too is, when it comes to trade relations, they're kind of relying on the Russians, oil and gas, agriculture, their sales, import, export. They didn't want this war to start.
Right.
And Erdogan
they wanted to end.
They wanted to end. And Erdogan has offered, he tried early on to broker, a ceasefire. And I think he's ready to play some part in any kind of ceasefire. I think I'm pretty sure that he welcomes President Trump's desire to bring this war to an end.
Yeah. I guess I was just surprised because Erdogan seems like such a shrewd operator it feels like he would have aligned with the authoritarian Putin. But it's really interesting how you outlined that he really had a lot of the aspects of his policy were really pro-Ukrainian.
Yeah, they've tried to walk a fine line.
Yeah.
As one very smart Turkish student explained to me, she said, "Look, we're like that. We're like the passenger on a plane when you're going into like a free fall, and the mask falls, and they tell you first give oxygen, like take oxygen for yourself, and then to your child. The Ukrainians are the child. Our economy is in trouble. We have a lot of challenges we're facing. We need the oxygen first, which is a continued, I guess, trade with Russia. Not signing on to the sanctions regime, and then we can do more for the Ukrainians." And then the other thing I have to say is I think Erdogan is one of these leaders who, many people in Washington talk about the rules-based order, right? That they say nobody consulted us on what the rules should be. And so we're not ready to sign onto that order. We want our say. And Erdogan has been very vocal that we need to look at redoing the UN and the Security Council. We need to Turkey needs to play a bigger role in some of the decision-making process because the Turks are actually taking action. And when you talk about Russia, Turks will tell you all the time, of all the NATO countries, they're the ones that went head-to-head with the Russians in Syria. They're the ones that went head-to-head to them in the South Caucasus, in Nagorno-Karabakh. And they're the ones that went head-to-head with the Russians in Libya. And when nobody else was doing that, Turkish forces, Turkey was the ones that pushed back Haftar with Russian support. Right, in Libya. And so they'll say that, we're actually taking action. And if we're going to be taking the action, we want to have say in how we're going to deal with Russia.
All right, well, then let's get to what the Turks' feelings are or were about Russian presence in Syria. I mean, first, can we just approach this can you explain for the audience what is neo-Ottomanism?
Well, there are some people that are concerned that Erdogan wants to reestablish the Ottoman Empire, right? I don't know if that's the case. He wants to, expand Turkish influence. What leader does it?
Yeah.
But I think the neo-Ottoman idea is that they can reconstitute the empire, right? Which is interesting because if that's the case and you have Putin who's clearly trying to reconstitute the Russian Empire, then you have if you look at historically, I can't even count the number of wars the Ottomans and the Russians fought. And again, the Turks will tell you, we know the Russians well. We fought dozens of wars with them. They caused many, many problems for the Ottomans. When we talk about mass migration, forced migration, if you look from the Balkans, if you look from the Caucasus, large numbers of refugees that were forced into the Ottoman Empire because they were chased out by Russia and their allies in the Caucasus and in the Balkans during the Balkans wars, during wars in the Caucasus. So if it's true that Erdogan's trying to reestablish the Ottoman Empire, and Putin's doing what he's doing, they're on a collision course, right? My experience with the Turks is, and going back to Erdogan and Putin, one of the things that Putin figured out, which I don't think we've ever figured out, is how important personal relationships are. And, he's constantly reaching out to Erdogan, talking to Erdogan. I think our leaders in the past have sometimes failed to appreciate that and appreciate how much a visit means or a invitation, to the U.S. means for a leader like Erdogan, just culturally, if you offering someone a cup of tea or not offering them a cup of tea has a huge impact on the relationship. We in the United States, I've seen this my whole career. We don't understand how important it is in places like Turkey, in the Middle East,
to show up,
to make a phone call. There are other factors why, any U.S. president has a lot more competing interests on whether they should do that or not do that than Putin does. Putin's competing interest is he decides to do it, he does it. And he doesn't have a lot of world leaders to call, by the way, because he's kind of isolated.
And here we have to worry about human rights, and we've got all sorts of concerns about Erdogan's behavior.
Yeah, and human rights, different competing lobbies here.
Yeah.
And, of course, the U.S. president is always in high demand. I would suggest that Putin, right now doesn't have a lot of people calling him, and hopefully we can keep it that way.
All right, so
Can you update our audience? I admit to being a little confused. Did the Russians pull out of Tartus in Syria, or did they just reduce their presence, or what's the status today?
My understanding is they've reduced their presence significantly. They're in a very tenuous situation, but they're trying to get back in. They're trying to hold on and then re-expand.
And are the Turks going to block them, or what's their attitude towards
I think a lot depends on what U.S. policy towards Syria is going to be. And, the Turks, I don't think necessarily want the Russians back there in force, but the Turks are probably waiting for a signal from Washington, as everybody else is in the region.
And so the Europeans are saying we should engage with the new leader in Syria. The outgoing Biden administration did send some mid-level diplomats over to meet with him. There are frequent op-eds that we should relax sanctions against the new Syrian government because they're on their back economically, and we don't want terrorism to resuscitate, if you will. Do you buy all that? What is your sense of how about this? What are the range of policy options in Syria right now? And should we trust that the new president has changed his stripes, or is he still ISIS?
Well, has he changed his stripes? I'm sure he has a lot of competing interests around him as well, is my understanding. I think that the Turks did a very good job of kind of preparing him for what the position he's in now.
Bought him some suits.
And kind of I told him, you got to walk away from that past. Like, we're not interested in being associated with a leader who is an extremist. It doesn't help our image, right? And it's not going to attract the type of investment that you need to rebuild, like reconstruction of Syria. And they need a lot of help. And that help is not going to come from Russia. It's probably going to come from, the EU and from the United States. So they're going to demand that you're not still in bed with extremist groups.
Yeah.
I think my guess is, or my understanding is, he's trying to work through all that, but you just don't walk away from those relationships. There are competing interests in the government and throughout the country. It's a very complicated situation, and we have to approach it with a lot of understanding of the nuance. My own view is we just can't make the mistake that the previous administration made of thinking that we can turn our backs on the Middle East and focus on other parts of the world.
Yeah.
Because I think, 7 October should have showed everybody in the United States that was a big mistake.
Yeah.
The Middle East wasn't so calm and it wasn't so organized. And we had a horrible terrorist attack take place and then a war start, which caused not only a disruption for U.S. policy in the Middle East, but also kind of blew back on us domestically. And, some things happened in the United States domestically that I think we should have all been paying attention to. That just shows how integrated the world is today. So we can't ignore the Middle East.
Yeah.
I personally do believe we should probably be talking to the new Syrian regime. They're in power.
Yeah.
And we should probably give them some, and my understanding is the administration is doing this, giving them some, we have our expectations. You need to meet these expectations. And then we can consider helping.
Well, sometimes the CIA is the first to talk to new controversial regimes. Is that a good way to use our intelligence services here as first contact?
The idea of intelligence diplomacy. The previous administration talked about it a lot. It was almost as if it was a new thing. It had, it's not a new thing. It's been used forever. And we're often, the agency, the intelligence community, especially the operations people, are often the ones that are talking to these bad guys before they become good. So we have pre-existing relationships. We understand the nuance. We've had people on the ground. So I think it's good. I just, my concern as an intelligence officer was that sometimes it becomes too much of a priority. We shouldn't forget our core mission either.
That's right.
But, Director Burns, when he was the director, he'd spent a lot of time shuttle diplomacy. And, he was probably the best person to be doing it.
All right. So Turkey has interests throughout the Middle East. At the beginning of the podcast, you mentioned that they have a lot of rivalries. Who are there? They have a very complicated relationship with Israel, but who are their rivals? And can you touch on a little bit about the natural opposition from the region?
Sure. So historically, the Greeks, Greece, Athens, Ankara, ups and downs. Right now, in the last year plus, the Turks have tried to ease tensions in the East Med with the Greeks. I think they've had some success. Erdogan, his policy has been, he's trying to reduce tensions, I think, to signal to the Europeans and to the U.S. that he needs investment. They're open for business, and they don't want like a conflict with another NATO ally, which is very good because we don't need that when we're dealing with everything that Russia's doing in Ukraine, and then competition, from the PRC, and of course everything that's happening in Iran right now. Iran is definitely a potential rival. Many Americans don't know, but there's a very large portion of the Iranian population are ethnic Turks. They're Azeris in the north. So the Turks have some influence there. And of course, they have immediate national security interests on stability in Iran, or what could happen if the Iranians get their hands on a nuclear weapon, which is not in Ankara's best interest, right? And of course, there's also this kind of Shia-Sunni rivalry thing. It's a very serious issue. But as I said, I think Erdogan wants to be seen as a leader of the Sunni community. Obviously, the supreme leader is seen as the leader of the Shia community.
Yeah.
You look at
what about Saudi? I mean, are they rivals for who's the leader of?
Yes, there's some competition there too. With like the Gulf states, then there's competition, then there's rivalry, and Turkish policy has kind of gone to some extremes, I think, with the Gulf states. Right now, my understanding is they're in a better, like their relations have improved. Egypt is a complicated relationship. You mentioned Israel. Okay, we have to go back.
Yeah, we got to go to Israel.
But before Israel, I do want to talk about like Armenia, Azerbaijan. We're very close to, and again, most Americans aren't following this, but a potential like agreement between Baku and Yerevan for some kind of diplomatic relations, which would be a big win, in my opinion, for Armenia and for the United States, because it would end Armenia's isolation and kind of over-reliance on Russia and Iran as being like their corridors for trade. The Turks are ready to open the border. I think they want to open the border. They just need this peace agreement to be reached between Baku and Armenia.
U.S. interest for this Nagorno-Karabakh agreement to be reached.
It's in U.S. interest, yes, for Azerbaijan and Armenia to open diplomatic relations, to sign a peace agreement. And I think we're close, right? People have been working very hard on this, and I hope that it can be accomplished because I do think it's a big benefit for the Armenians and for the U.S. It would be a benefit for Turkey, in my assessment, and it would be a loss for some of our competitors or challengers in the region. And by the way, I should also say that the Armenian prime minister, like we need to give him his due credit. He has taken a very, very courageous stance against Moscow to do kind of some of the things he's done. And we won't go into all the details just because it'd be such a complicated issue. But the Armenian prime minister has shown, in my opinion, a lot of courage.
Right.
And he needs a lot of support from the U.S.
So on Israel, I mean, they, of course, have relations. We've had the flotilla. We've had all sorts of complicated relations of late. I've seen it written that right now, Israel and Turkey's interests are aligned. It's just simply that Erdogan and Netanyahu can't possibly get along. Is that a fair estimate?
I think that this is an area where personal relationships, like personalities, are having a oversized impact on the bilateral relationship. And yeah, they do have common interests, in my opinion. And by the way, there have been periods when the relationship has been very good. If you go to like Turkey in 2000, 2001, 2002, like all the resorts were filled with Israeli tourists, right? Like they were a big military partner in the region. Turkey was for Israel. So I think that, as you mentioned, I agree with that statement that their interests align more than kind of we're seeing right now. And a lot of it has to do with relationships. And, I hope before 7 October, the Turks made a very strong effort, and the Israelis, to improve relations. Because you remember after the flotilla, there was like what was it, the Mavi Marmaris, there was a huge breakdown in the bilateral relationship. And the Turks made a concerted effort to improve relations. The Israelis did as well. 7 October threw everything into into the garbage bin to some degree, because President Erdogan feels very strongly, he's a supporter of the Palestinian cause. Obviously the Israelis have their view. My own opinion is, again, like personality of like Netanyahu and Erdogan, they clash.
Yeah, that's right. I can see that. All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about Turkey's influence and interest in Lebanon. Where do they stand here? And weren't they rivals with Hezbollah when Hezbollah was in a firmer position in Lebanon?
Yes. So first we have to say Lebanon was part of the Ottoman Empire. There are still communities in northern Lebanon. There were Turkish-speaking communities, which is kind of interesting. The Turks, I don't think, have a lot of influence in Lebanon. I am glad that you asked about Lebanon, because there's a lot of stuff happening in Lebanon too. I always say that last year, the Turks two of our allies handed us two big opportunities. One, the Turks in Syria, and the Israelis in Lebanon, what they did to Lebanese Hezbollah.
Yeah.
Without them, we would not be where we're at right now. There is an opportunity to really change the dynamics in Lebanon in the future.
Yeah.
And my understanding is our, Deputy Special Envoy for the Middle East was just in Beirut meeting with people. I hope that the meetings went well. The Lebanese are anxious for U.S. support to help rebuild Lebanon, and for U.S. support to help them convince the Israelis to remove troops from remaining parts of Lebanon in the south, where the Israelis entered after Hassan Nasrallah made the biggest mistake of his life by signing on to this war that Hamas started. In my personal opinion, with the encouragement of Tehran, the axis of resistance went after the Israelis, and they paid a huge price.
Yeah.
And you have to give the Israelis credit. I have to say this, what they did, I don't think anybody saw that coming. As an intelligence officer, if I was wearing a hat, I'd take it off. Hats off. The pager operation, then the next day, walkie-talkies, targeted strikes, undermining the leadership the way they did, bit by bit, very calculated campaign. And now everyone wants the Lebanese armed forces to disarm Hezbollah.
And are they? Aren't they too weak?
There's a big debate inside, I think, of Lebanon on whether or not they're ready. But I think the overall assessment is the LAF is not ready yet.
But we've supported them for years, as I recall, right?
We have.
But just at some medium-sized level for them not to become too powerful, or?
Well, I think a lot of our assistance was aimed at trying to help them counter Sunni threats, right? A lot of our assistance was aimed at trying to stabilize, make the LAF, because the LAF is kind of like the national police force.
Yeah.
In Lebanon. But we have to remember that the LAF is staffed by all the, you have Shia, Sunni, Christians are all in the LAF. And my understanding, only 18% are Christian. So the Shia and the Sunni make up the largest portion of the force. And if there is an attempt to disarm, this is what some Lebanese are arguing, if there's an attempt now to disarm Hezbollah, that the Shia population will not support it, and then the army will fall apart. And then there'll be infighting between especially the Sunni and the Shia.
So there's pressure then for them not to go after the remnants of Hezbollah.
There's some pressure. And one thing, that I just saw, I think, a statement from the assistant special envoy that, we should disarm all the militias in Lebanon, which is a good statement because, there are still Palestinian groups that are armed there. There are other groups that probably have arms. So we should just re-empower the Lebanese state to run the country. And of course, we have to deal with the corruption, systemic corruption.
But when rightfully so, I mean, you rightfully credited the Israelis for the pager operation and everything else. But is it fair to say that Israel has truly degraded Hezbollah to we're acting like Hezbollah is down and out on its back, not going to be able to come back. Is that accurate?
No. The Israelis significantly degraded their capabilities. But of course, there's always the danger that they can reemerge. There's always the danger some other group will fill the void that was created. There's kind of a vacuum now to some degree, which is how we got to Hezbollah in the first place. Right? If we go back in the history of the what happened in Lebanon in the civil war. So I argued last year when the Israelis were really stepping up their operations in Lebanon, I argued, one, the Israelis have a right to do it because the Hezbollah and their allies were attacking northern Israel, and 60 to 70,000 Israelis were forced from their homes because of that threat. So the Israelis had to deal with that threat. Two, the Israelis were going to they were going to cause a lot of harm to Hezbollah. We need to be ready to move quickly to fill that vacuum and not allow the Iranians to fill it, because that's how the Iranians, or the current Iranian regime, that's how Hezbollah became so powerful. They built roads, schools. It wasn't just giving arms to Hezbollah. They provided a lot of social programs, funded it. So someone should be ready to step in now.
And I bet we're not. I bet we're not insufficient.
I think there's one, listen, this administration inherited a very, very complicated international situation. There's a lot of push, or pull for focus on other parts of the world. I say it all the time too. They're talking now the Western Hemisphere is getting a lot more attention, which is good, right? I mean, for years we ignored the Western Hemisphere, and it's like our neighbor. So that's all good, but that doesn't mean sometimes people say we can't do it all. I don't know that we have a choice. You can't ignore the Middle East. Of course, near peer competition, PRC, you can't ignore it. It's got to be dealt with.
Right.
Russia, Russia's still a major threat and a major problem. And Iran, right? So you have all these issues. You can't just say we're going to focus on one, in my opinion. And I would argue that if you want to go after competition with China, push back on the Russians, push back on the Iranians, it's a worldwide effort. If you go back to the Reagan years,
yeah,
we were pushing back on the Soviets all over the world.
Every theater,
right? It's not just in Taiwan, or it's not just in, the Pacific region. It's got to be everywhere.
Yeah. I mean, it's good to hear you say that, because there's a lot of people out there that think we can only do Asia or only do Taiwan, and we're a global power with global interests.
I say it all the time. If you go back to the Second World War, we fought in North Africa, in Europe, in Asia. By the way, when the Russians, I have to say this, please forgive me, but when the Russians talk about how they won the Second World War, how they defeated the fascists with minimal help from the U.S. and Great Britain, and the Russians always make this argument, we delayed opening the Western Front, what the Russians never tell anybody, and they kind of gloss over the fact, is that they did nothing in the Pacific while we were fighting the Imperial Japanese Army.
Right.
They did not declare war on Japan. They waited until at the very end of the war, right? And it was Americans mainly, with our allies, the Australians and the Brits, but it was Americans mainly that died fighting island to island to defeat the Japanese, right? And so when the Russians, Russians just say this to me all the time, we won. No, you didn't. We will talk about Lend-Lease. So we armed the world. We were the arsenal democracy. We fought in the Pacific in a horrific campaign, super complicated, in North Africa and in Europe, right? And we were arming the world. We're Americans. We could do anything, right? We can secure the southern border. We can deal with problems in the Western Hemisphere. We can compete with the Chinese. We can, we can resolve this conflict in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, on terms that are beneficial for the United States, and our partners, including the Ukrainians. We can do it all. I'm convinced of it. I've seen it done before.
We can help broker a decent ceasefire, you think, in Ukraine?
I think we can. We just have to recognize that, we can't make concessions to the Russians and appease the Russians. The Russians need to make the concessions.
Yeah.
And we need to remember that, in my opinion, the Russians are not in a position of strength. They don't have the good real estate right now, or the price they're asking for the real estate that they're trying to sell is the value is, they're overvaluing it, and we should understand that.
Yeah. All right. Well, as we begin to wrap up, we've got to touch on Iran. When you mention Hezbollah and we mention that they're significantly degraded, that's the first step in an argument that timing is terrific for Israel to bomb Iran. It goes something like, Hezbollah is down and out for now. The Israelis have blown up surface-to-air systems across Syria, thereby making the pathway there a little bit easier. Once you're within Iran,
the first two campaigns allowed for or blew up the S-300 surface-to-air missile systems that the Russians provided the Iranians, that the other deterrent to Israeli action besides Hezbollah invading Israel was these much vaunted Iranian ballistic missile system. Apparently, they're not as terrific as they are. And you put on top of that the considerable progress the Iranians have made in enrichment. With all of that on the table, do you think Israel is going to try and bomb Iran here this year?
Ooh, good question. I think, I'm not going to predict what the Israelis are going to do. I think that the Israelis recognize that Iran is the heart of the problem, this current regime. I hope this administration recognizes that the maximum pressure campaign that they had when they were in office before it was working. In my personal opinion, it's the right way to approach this. And I hope that people in the administration understand that Iran, because that Iran is not Iraq, right? That there are a lot of Iranians that are waiting for change. They're looking for a sign that they'll have some support if they try and undo the current regime, which has been.
You think the Iranian people?
I think the Iranian people want change. They want to be integrated into the rest of the world. They're tired of the isolation, and they don't. They've been forced to live with the regime that which has unfortunately, they have the force, they have the power, but that power is dwindling very quickly. They have a lot of economic problems. The economy is in terrible shape. The Israelis demonstrated how, as you said, the weapon systems were nowhere. They could not defend. They pushed their militias, they pushed their proxies into war, and then they could not defend them. So, and by the way, I just read an article this morning that now the Shia militias in Iraq are considering disarming, which would be a very good step, right? And that the Iranians are telling them, you do what you need to do, because I think the Iranians realize that they're in a very, very precarious situation. I hope that we don't have to go to war to stop the Iranians from, breakdown.
Nuclear, yeah.
I hope that, and I think there are other ways to do it, but I think that the ways to do that involve taking a hard line for now and returning to the maximum pressure campaign. If the Iranians, the administration has offered direct talks, I guess the Iranians have said no. I think we should stick to our position.
Last question. So the Iranian people seem to have, or at least the regime, seem to have quite the resilience to really live in absolute terrible economic conditions. Do you think maximum pressure can work? Is there time for maximum pressure to work before all these conditions that I just described go away? Won't Israel say, we got to go now? We don't have time we don't have another year to let maximum pressure work.
Right. The challenge we always have is one administration has one policy, the other new administration changes the policy, right? The Iranian regime doesn't have to worry about that because we had presidential elections in Iran. The Iranian president really doesn't have the final say. It's the supreme leader. You look at Russia, Putin has the final say. So policy stays consistent for 20 years.
Right.
Right? Because you have a dictator. We don't have that, thank God. Going back to your question so I do think maximum pressure could have worked.
Yeah.
And it can still work.
Okay.
But we have to enforce it. By the way, there's a value here for the Ukrainians too, because every time you go to Ukraine, the air raids, half or more than half of the attacks are being launched using Iranian armed drones, Iranian weapon systems. We need to stop Iran from supplying the Russians with the tools to kill innocent Ukrainians. But going back to your question, I think the Israelis, they're probably ready, is my guess, to do something if they feel they have to, and they're not going to let the Iranians get a nuclear weapon. They understand what the consequences is. If this regime in Tehran does that, I'm sure that they would prefer to do it with us, and with some other allies.
But you think they'd go alone if maximum pressure after some period of time is not yielding results?
The Israelis have shown over and over again that when they have to, they will go alone.
Fascinating. Glenn Korn, thank you so much. That was terrific.
Thank you.
That was Glenn Korn. I'm Michael Allen. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.